Blackstone Square had never been a place where wolves were chosen. It was a place where the forgotten came to stay forgotten, and for 15 years, that had suited Mira just fine. Rain fell in cold threads over the cobblestones. She knelt at the edge of the crowd, chasing scattered herbs across wet stone, her grey dress soaked through, her bare feet numb against the ground. Stone columns lined every side of the square, grey and rain-slicked, built long ago to make ordinary people feel smaller than they already were. Around her, the crowd had dressed for a different kind of day. Young women stood in jewels. Daughters of powerful alphas waited in perfect rows, chins lifted for a king who hadn't even arrived. Merchant families paraded furs they likely couldn't afford. Even a few rogue packs had wandered down from the hills, hoping to finally be noticed. Everyone in that square wanted to be seen. Mira wanted the opposite. Invisible people survived longer. She'd known that since she was a child, long before she understood why. She kept her wet hair pressed against her cheeks, and her eyes fixed on the ground, the way she had made herself small since she was 8 years old, since the night her village burned, and her mother screamed one sentence before the fire swallowed the rest of it. Run. Never tell them who you are. A dying servant carried her into the mountains after that, and left her with a second warning before his wounds finally took him. Never let an alpha claim you. The moment they scent your blood, kingdoms will burn the world down to have it. So she had never joined a pack, never accepted courtship, never once let a stranger's hand close around hers long enough to wonder why her skin ran colder than it should. 15 years of disappearing, undone by nothing more than a torn basket and a king riding home from a war. The whisper had moved through the crowd all morning. The Alpha King returns before sunset. King Kalen Ashbourne, who had never lost a battle, never broken a treaty, and, if the rumor was true, never once taken a mate. When his black horse finally entered the square, the silence dropped like a blade. 1,000 people bowed at once, one dark wave of heads. Mira didn't. Not from defiance. She simply hadn't noticed the world had gone still, too busy gathering one last sprig of yarrow from between the stones. The horse stopped beside her. The stillness reached her a moment, before the reason for it did. She looked up slowly, into eyes so pale as silver they hardly looked real, set in a face built for war, not softness. Reins slid off broad shoulders wrapped in black. He was studying her the way a man studies something he'd been told didn't exist anymore. It wasn't hunger in his expression. It wasn't curiosity either. It was recognition. Kalen had scented every kind of wolf the world made. Alphas, rogues, betas bred for 100 bloodlines. He had never once smelled this, untouched, ancient, like the first snowfall settling over cedar, a scent he'd only ever read about in sealed royal records he wasn't meant to open twice. Something in his chest, something that had never once spoken in his life, said only, mine. It had never done that before. Not once. Not for any of the daughters paraded in front of him over the years. Not for anyone at all. He dismounted. Every noble daughter in the square straightened at once, certain the king had finally come to choose. Instead, he crossed the square without a glance at any of them. Past silk, past jewels, past perfect posture, until he stood over a barefoot herb girl still kneeling in the mud. "Are you taken?" he asked. Of every question Mira had braced herself for across 15 years of hiding, that one had never occurred to her. Her mouth went dry. "No," she said, before she could stop herself. Kalen nodded once, as if she'd only confirmed something he'd already decided. "You are now." He took her hand. "I claim her." The square broke apart into noise. Gasps, shouted protests, elders frozen mid-step, guards trading horrified glances. An unmarried king had just claimed an unknown orphan in front of the entire kingdom, with no bloodline inquiry, no council vote, no permission asked of a single living soul. "You don't even know who I am," Mira said, wrenching at her hand. "I know enough." "You've made a mistake." "I don't make mistakes." Panic rose in her chest before she could stop it. If he kept holding on, he would eventually learn the truth, and her blood could not stay hidden forever. Not from a king, who already seemed to sense it in the air between them. She pulled harder, and the instant their skin broke apart, something ancient tore loose between them. The stones beneath their feet split with a sound like ice cracking on a lake. A wind roared through the square, carrying no warmth at all, and every wolf present felt their own wolf whimper into silence. Kaylin's silver eyes widened. Mira's face went white, because she already knew exactly what it meant. Her blood had just answered him. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Kaylin didn't let go. Whatever had just happened between them, he intended to understand it, even if he'd just upended 100 years of careful peace to do it, in front of the entire watching kingdom. Somewhere in the crowd, an old voice broke the stunned quiet. The king's bond. It's still real. An elder dropped to his knees, repeating the words like both a prayer and a warning. High above the square, on a rooftop slick with rain, a watcher who had been waiting for exactly this moment finally moved. Gone before the king even lifted her from the ground. 4 words left behind in the dark. Kill her before sunrise. The gates of Blackstone Castle rose out of the storm, like something carved from the mountain itself. Torches burning gold against black stone and black rain. Mira had spent her whole life staying clear of places exactly like this. Now 400 warriors were escorting her straight through the front doors. She tried the words again, her voice raw from repeating them the entire ride. I am nobody. Please, let me go. Kaylin didn't slow his stride down the corridor. You said that in the square. You said it twice on the road. You'll say it a dozen more times tonight. And my answer isn't going to change. You don't understand what you've done. I understand precisely what I've done. He glanced sideways at her, something almost like humor flickering behind the silver. I ignored 30 years of instinct in one afternoon. It feels strange. I intend to keep doing it anyway. They reached the council chamber before she could argue further, and 4 faces turned toward the door at once. A broad-shouldered man in guard's leathers straightened with visible relief. Commander Rowan, loyal to the king since before either of them could grow a beard. Beside him stood a silver-haired woman with quiet, measuring eyes. Lady Celine, the king's advisor, whose gaze found Mira and simply stayed there. A younger noblewoman in deep burgundy silk looked at Mira the way one looks at something spoiled. Lady Celeste, who had spent 3 years assuming the king's mate bond, would eventually settle on her family's bloodline. And near the hearth, arms folded, stood an old wolf with a soldier's stillness and a judge's eyes. High Elder Varick, who did not bow, did not smile, only watched. Your Majesty. Rowan's relief was plain. The full council convenes within the hour. They've already heard what happened in the square. Then let them hear the rest of it from me, not from rumor. Varick spoke before Kaylin finished crossing the room. You claimed an unknown woman off the street before 10,000 witnesses. 3 neighboring courts will call it an insult. You have not merely offended a few noble houses, Your Majesty. You may have handed our enemies the excuse they've wanted for years. I understand I did it regardless. You have refused 11 proposed unions in as many years, Varick said, each word deliberate, and let hundreds more die quietly on your steward's desk before they ever reached you. Alpha daughters, royal houses, every match this council placed in front of you, your wolf refused to acknowledge. And in one afternoon, you claim a girl who sells herbs for coin. My wolf never spoke for any of them. Kaylin's voice stayed even. It spoke for her. The chamber went silent. Lady Celeste's mouth curved thin and cold. How convenient. The one time his wolf finally chooses, it happens to be someone no house can hold him accountable to. Celine said nothing at all. She only studied Mira the way a person studies handwriting they almost recognize. And Mira, feeling the full weight of that gaze, drew her shawl higher over her shoulder, over the place where an old crescent mark hid beneath the fabric. Celine's eyes followed the motion, only for a moment. Then she looked away, as though she'd seen nothing worth remarking on at all. They gave Mira a room in the East Wing that night, warm and unfamiliar, and far too large for a girl who'd spent 15 years sleeping in temple corners. She stayed awake long after the candles burned low, listening to an unfamiliar castle breathe around her, waiting for the moment someone would finally recognize what she was. She didn't have to wait long. The window latch gave under someone's hand, quiet enough that she almost missed it. A shape slid across the floor, blade already drawn, moving with the trained silence of a man who had done this before. Mira didn't scream. 15 years had taught her better than that. She rolled off the bed as the blade cut the air where her throat had been, scrambling into the corner just as the door slammed open. Kaelin crossed the room faster than her eyes could follow, and the fight ended almost before it began. The assassin was skilled. Skilled had never once been enough against the Alpha King. Steel met flesh, once, twice, and the man collapsed against the stone, blood spreading dark beneath him. He wasn't dead yet. His lips moved, dragging in one last breath, to spend on words instead of air. "The Moon Princess," he gasped, staring past Kaelin straight at Mira. "Must die." Then he was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the fight had been. Kaelin turned slowly, blood still on his hands, and looked at Mira the way he had looked at her in the square. Except now the recognition in his eyes had a name to match it, one that explained the scent, the cracked stones, the pulse of power that had torn loose between them, like something ancient waking up. Mira stood frozen against the wall, her shawl slipping from her shoulder, the pale crescent mark finally catching the candlelight. She didn't move to cover it this time. There was no point left in hiding. "Moon Princess," Kaelin said quietly, testing the words as though he didn't quite believe them, even as he spoke them. Mira said nothing. She didn't have to. He already knew she wasn't an ordinary orphan at all. Kaelin didn't ask again that night. He knelt instead, closing the assassin's eyes with 2 fingers, and when he finally looked at Mira, his voice had lost its command. "Who are you?" Mira pulled her shawl straight, hands trembling in a way she hated. "Nobody. I told you that in the square. Nobody doesn't make stone crack. Nobody doesn't have men crossing kingdoms to kill her before sunrise. Then maybe you should let them." No. She wanted to hate him for how simply he said it. Instead, something in her chest, something exhausted from 15 years of running, wanted only to sit down and finally stop. She didn't answer him, but she remembered anyway, the way she always did when someone pressed too close to the truth. Smoke thick enough to taste. Her mother's voice cracking mid-sentence, shoving her beneath the floorboards before soldiers dragged both her parents into the courtyard. A scream, cut short by fire. A servant half carrying her through the mountains for 3 days, on a wound that never stopped bleeding, dying with one warning still on his lips. Never let an alpha claim you. After that, there had only been temple floors, borrowed names, and 100 towns she'd left before anyone learned her face well enough to remember it. Kaelin watched her go somewhere far away behind her eyes, and didn't try to follow her there. He only waited, letting the silence sit between them instead of forcing it apart. "I've buried people too," he said finally, quieter than she'd ever heard him. "I know what it does to a person, carrying that alone. I won't force your secrets from you," he added. "Not tonight. Not ever, if that's your choice. But I won't let you disappear either." Mira looked up at him, surprised into silence. It was the first promise anyone had made her in 15 years that didn't ask for anything in return. She didn't trust it, not fully, but the days that followed made it harder to keep her distance. The castle's infirmary overflowed with soldiers wounded in border skirmishes, and when Mira found herself among them one morning, her hands moved before her mind caught up, cleaning a gash, easing a fevered soldier's breathing, murmuring over a wound that closed cleaner than it should have. One boy, barely old enough to hold a sword, gripped her hand through the pain and wouldn't let go until the shaking stopped. Word spread fast through a castle, hungry for something good to believe in. Servants left flowers outside her door. Soldiers bowed when she passed, no longer out of duty, but something closer to devotion. Lady Celeste watched all of it curdle into something worse than jealousy. She heals soldiers, and the whole castle forgets she was selling weeds in the mud 3 weeks ago, she murmured to a nearby noblewoman, watching Mira laugh softly with an old guard whose arm she'd just wrapped. Later, passing Mira in the corridor, her smile turned brittle. How fortunate, being adored for so little. The rest of us had to earn it. Kaelin, standing at the far end of the hall, didn't hear the bitterness in it. He was too busy watching Mira laugh at all. Far beyond Blackstone's borders, in a chamber lit only by cold blue flame, a council that answered to no crown Kaelin had ever recognized, received word that the Moonblood had survived. An old voice, wrapped in shadow, spoke first. 15 years we searched. 15 years we believed the bloodline dead. She lives, another confirmed. claimed by the Alpha King himself. A ripple of unease moved through the chamber. The Alpha King's armies were no small obstacle. Then a decision, delivered without hesitation. Take her alive. If the king stands between you and the girl, the voice paused, almost gently. Remove him. A throne can always be refilled. The blood cannot be replaced. Celine found Kaelin alone that night in the archive, an old ledger of royal bloodlines open beneath her candle. I compared the birthmark, she said quietly, no preamble. The one on her shoulder. I've seen it before, only in drawings, in records older than this castle. The crescent belongs to the Moon Dynasty bloodline. Exactly, Kaelin. Not similar. Exact. Kaelin said nothing for a long moment. You're certain? I've spent 30 years reading these records. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. He looked toward the east wing, toward the room where Mira slept, unaware that the woman who'd spent 15 years erasing herself had just been found again in ink centuries old, and that somewhere beyond his borders, men were already deciding how easily he could be replaced. For the first time since the square, the Alpha King felt something close to fear. Celine closed the ledger, but didn't look away from the page's afterimage, as though the words were still burning behind her eyes. There's more you should hear, she said. Sit, Kaelin. This isn't a short story. He didn't sit, but he didn't leave either. 1,000 years ago, two bloodlines didn't merely coexist, Celine said. They ruled together. The Ashbourne line held the wolves' strength. The Moon Dynasty held something else. An older magic, tied to the first wolves who ever walked beneath a full moon. Together, joined by blood and bond. They didn't just rule kingdoms. They awakened something called the First Crown. I've never heard that name, because it was erased, deliberately. The First Crown wasn't a throne, Kaelin. It was a power. Whoever united both bloodlines could command every wolf kingdom as one. Peace, if the histories are honest. But peace built on that much power frightened the very council that swore to protect it. Her voice thinned, so they burned it out. Every Moon Dynasty household, hunted in a single generation. History remembers it as a plague. It wasn't. It was extermination, dressed up kindly enough that no one questioned it for 1,000 years. Except one survived. One family escaped into the mountains before the purge reached them. A single child, if the oldest record is even true. Everyone assumed the bloodline died with her, wherever she vanished to. Celine looked at him now, steady. I don't believe it died, Kaelin. I think it's been walking your castle halls for 3 weeks, cleaning wounds and drawing flowers to her door. Kaelin said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, it came out rougher than he intended. My wolf never chose anyone. Not once, in 30 years. I told myself it was pride, instinct, something ordinary. He shook his head slowly. It wasn't ordinary at all. It recognized her before I did. Because whatever this crown is, it recognized her first. He'd spent his whole life believing a king made his own choices. Now he wasn't certain he'd ever made one at all, or whether destiny had simply been patient, waiting 15 years for a barefoot girl to walk into a square in the rain. Outside the door, Mira stood frozen, one hand pressed flat against the stone, listening to her own life explained by people who didn't know she could hear every word. Extermination, erased, the First Crown. 15 years of hiding, undone by a question in the rain. 15 years of careful invisibility, and it had never been enough, because she had never simply been an orphan. She was the reason a council somewhere had ordered a king killed. She was the reason armies would come. She ran. Not toward the gates. She knew better than that. Knew guards would stop her before she reached them. But toward the old servant's stair at the end of the east wing, the one route she'd already memorized without meaning to. 15 years of instinct didn't disappear just because someone had been kind to her. She made it 3 floors down before a hand closed around her wrist. Let go, she said, not fighting him, just breathless. No, Kaelin said, the same word he'd given her in the square, the same word he'd give her 100 times more if she asked. His grip wasn't hard. It never had been, not once since the square, but it didn't loosen either. You don't understand what I am. Her voice cracked on it. Finally, after 15 years of never once saying it aloud. I'm not a survivor, Kaelin. I'm a reason. I'm the reason kingdoms will invade. I'm the reason men are already deciding whether you live or die. Everyone who's ever loved me has died for it. Everyone. Then they'll face me first. He said it the way he said everything, without hesitation, without performance, simply true. Mira looked up at him, and for the first time since the fire took her parents, she let someone see her fully afraid, instead of hiding it behind calm. He didn't flinch from it. He only pulled her closer, until the space between 15 years of running and finally being found had narrowed down to almost nothing at all. Neither of them heard the messenger arrive at the castle gates before dawn, half frozen from riding through the night. Nor did they hear him deliver his report to Commander Rowan in the courtyard. 3 enemy banners spotted crossing the eastern border by morning light, black cloth marked with a broken crown, moving fast, moving straight toward Blackstone. Rowan had never seen that symbol raised in a decade of border skirmishes. He didn't need Celine's histories to feel the weight of it. "Wake the king," he said quietly. Now. The Shadow Council hadn't waited for a reply. They had already sent their armies marching. The army was 3 weeks out, by Rowan's counting. The Shadow Council didn't intend to wait that long. The poison came first, slipped into a pitcher meant for Mira's evening meal. She never touched it. Some old instinct pushed the cup away before her hand even registered wrongness, a heartbeat before the taster convulsed on the floor. The archers came next, 3 of them stationed on a hillside overlooking the training yard. Mira felt the first arrow before she saw it, some pressure behind her ribs pulling her sideways half a second before the shaft split the air where her throat had been. Fire took the East Wing storerooms 2 nights later, smoke curling under doors before any watchman raised the alarm. Mira woke coughing, already moving, already pulling 2 sleeping servants through a window, before Kaelin's men reached the hall. Mira said nothing about any of it. Not to Caelin, not even to herself, in the quiet hour before dawn when she lay awake turning the same question over. Her body had started keeping secrets even from her, moving before fear caught up, warning her of danger she had no way of sensing. 15 years of hiding had taught her caution. This was something else entirely. By the 4th attempt, no one in Blackstone called it bad luck anymore. It came through the old kitchen tunnels, 4 men in black, moving fast and silent, trained well enough that the first guard on watch never had time to shout. Mira woke to the smell of oiled steel before she heard footsteps. She didn't think. She moved, rolling from the bed, snatching the fire iron from the hearth, meeting the first man's blade, with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a girl who'd spent her life pulling herbs from mud. Somewhere behind her ribs, cold light gathered and released, quick as instinct, guiding her hands through a fight no one had ever taught her. Caelin reached the room mid-strike, expecting to defend her. Instead, he found her already standing over one attacker, breathing hard, pale light fading from her eyes, like mist burning off in morning sun. "How?" he started. "I don't know," she said, and for once it wasn't a lie meant to protect a secret. She truly didn't. Together they finished what the infiltrators started. When the last man fell, Caelin looked at her the way he had looked at her in the square, except now the wonder in it had nowhere left to hide. He told himself it was only relief that she'd survived. He'd told himself that after the poison too, after the archers, after the fire, he was running out of ordinary words for whatever he felt, watching her fight at his side like she'd always belonged there. He refused to call it what it was. A king who admitted such things made himself easy to break. Still, when the healers came to check her for wounds, it was Caelin's hands that found the shallow cut along her forearm first, careful and quiet, wrapping it himself before anyone else could reach her. He said nothing about why. Neither did she. While the castle still buzzed with relief, Lady Celeste met a stranger in the shadow of the old chapel wall, where the torchlight didn't reach. "The girl fights now," the stranger said, unimpressed. "That complicates things. She won't for much longer." Celeste's voice was steadier and colder than anyone in the castle had ever heard it. "Tell your council I'll have her sleeping schedule, her guard rotations, whatever you need. All I ask in return is simple. When the girl is gone, the king will need comforting. See to it I'm the only one left standing close enough to offer it." The stranger inclined his head and vanished into the dark the way he'd come, leaving no proof he had ever stood there at all. Celeste smoothed her skirts and walked back toward the light, already composing the pleasant smile she'd wear at breakfast. The horns sounded 4 nights later, just past midnight. Not the horn for drills, not the horn for fire. 3 long blasts rolling off the mountains. The horn Blackstone hadn't sounded in a generation. The one that meant an army stood beyond the gates and intended to take them by morning. Kaelin was already moving before the 3rd blast finished, pulling Mira from sleep with one hand and reaching for his sword with the other. Weeks ago she would have run at the sound of those horns. Old instinct, older fear. Instead she reached for a blade of her own, because whatever she was, running had never once been the same thing as safe. Lockdown, Kaelin said. Now. Iron gates dropped across every corridor. Torches doubled along the walls. Soldiers who had trained for this their whole lives and never once needed it took their positions in silence, because there was nothing left worth saying. Outside the walls, the Shadow Council's banners covered the eastern hills like a black tide, and at the center of them all, Blackstone's watchmen saw something they hadn't yet dared report to the king. One banner stood taller than the rest, black cloth, marked with a crown broken clean in 2. The hunt was over. The war had arrived. The castle gates held for exactly 40 minutes. By the time the enemy broke through the outer wall, Blackstone's courtyard had become a churn of steel, fur, and firelight. Kaelin at the center of it, cutting a path through wolves twice his number, like a man who had never once considered losing. Mira fought at the edges, dragging wounded soldiers clear, doing what she could with a blade that still felt foreign in her hand. She didn't see the 4 enemy wolves break from the pack until they had already circled Kaelin from behind. She didn't decide what happened next. Her body simply moved past the decision entirely. Something ancient and cold tore loose from beneath her ribs, a light the color of moonlight on ice, and it didn't ask her permission before it left her hands. The silver wave hit the 4 wolves circling Kaelin and didn't stop there. It rolled outward across the courtyard, through enemy ranks, leaving nothing behind but stillness, where wolves had stood a heartbeat before. Every living thing in that courtyard stopped fighting at once. Kaelin turned, blood on his blade and disbelief on his face, staring at the girl standing where a wave of moonlight had just erased half an enemy company. Mira stared back at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. Her knees buckled a moment later, the strength that had carried the light draining out of her all at once. Kaelin crossed the distance before she hit the ground, catching her against his chest instead of the stones. There was no hiding this, not from the soldiers who'd watched it happen, not from the enemy survivors already fleeing toward their own lines to report exactly who they had found. By morning, the whisper had crossed both armies. The Moon Princess lives, and now, at last, they knew precisely where. In the enemy camp, the surviving commanders didn't mourn their dead, they celebrated. 15 years of searching had ended in one accidental burst of moonlight, and the Shadow Council's orders had just gotten simpler. Stop guessing, and go collect her. That night, Kaelin stood before the survivors gathered in the Great Hall and did the one thing his council had begged him never to do. Whatever bloodline she carries, whatever name history gave her, she bled for this castle when she owed it nothing. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. I name Mira, of the Moon Dynasty heir to this throne, and future Queen of Blackstone. Varric was on his feet before the hall finished gasping. You cannot simply declare a stranger. I can, Kaelin said. I just did. The council will never accept an unvetted, unbound. Then the council can explain to every soldier in this hall why the woman who saved their lives isn't worthy of a crown. Kaelin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Rebel if you must. My answer stays the same. By midnight, 3 council seats had already sent word they would not attend the coronation planning session. Rebellion, Kaelin understood, rarely announced itself with swords first. It began with empty chairs. Lady Celeste, seated near the back, said nothing at all, though her knuckles had gone white around her wine cup, and her mind was already composing the message she intended to send before sunrise. Later, in the quiet, after the hall emptied, Kaelin found Mira still staring at her own palms, as though they might do something unexpected again without warning. Does it frighten you? He asked. Everything about this frightens me. She looked up at him. Except you. Neither of them said the word that had been building between them for weeks now, through poison and fire and silver light. It sat in the space between their hands instead, unspoken, waiting for one of them to be brave enough first. He only tucked a strand of damp hair back from her face. his hand lingering a moment longer than the gesture required, and said nothing else at all. They didn't have long to sit with it. Before dawn, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower. Not the horn for an army this time, but a single low note Blackstone hadn't heard in living memory. The temperature on the wall had already dropped by the time Kalen reached it, frost crawling over stone that had been merely cold minutes before. Rowan met him there, face pale in the torchlight. "He's come himself, Your Majesty." He didn't need to say who. "The Shadow King has arrived to collect what's his." The Shadow King did not need an army to feel like one. He stood alone at the base of Blackstone's outer wall as dawn broke, flanked by nothing but a cold he seemed to carry with him. A tall figure, wrapped in black, that made the torchlight itself seem to dim near him. When he spoke, his voice reached every soldier on the wall, without seeming to rise at all. "Surrender the girl, Ashbourne, and I'll spare what's left of your kingdom the trouble of finding out what I'm capable of." Kalen stood at the wall's edge, close enough to answer without shouting. "No, you don't understand what she carries." "I understand precisely what she carries," Kalen said. "That's exactly why she stays." The Shadow King tilted his head, something almost like amusement crossing a face too still to properly read. "Then I'll collect her from the ruins instead. Sentiment is a poor substitute for strategy, Your Majesty." He turned and walked back toward his banners without waiting for a reply, as though the conversation had already told him everything he needed. From the wall behind Kalen, Mira felt something colder than fear pull tight behind her ribs. Not warning this time, but recognition, as though whatever slept inside her blood had just met something it remembered from long before either of them existed. By nightfall, Blackstone had stopped pretending this was a siege they might simply wait out. Every able body not already wounded was pressed into the walls, the forges, or the field kitchens. Rowan slept in his armor. Even Varric, for all his objections in the council chamber, spent that week drilling reserves he'd sworn only days earlier didn't exist. In the narrow hours between preparations, something else kept happening too. Mira asked Kalen to teach her properly, tired of instincts she didn't understand guiding a body she'd never trained. He obliged, correcting her footwork with more patience than his reputation suggested he owned, and didn't mention how often his hands lingered longer than correction required. One evening, Celine produced an old set of court music no one had played in years, and Kalen, to the visible shock of every guard in the hall, pulled Mira into a dance neither of them knew particularly well. They stepped on each other twice. Neither of them minded. Rowan, watching from the doorway, later swore he'd never once seen his king laugh like that in 30 years of service. She told him about the smell of her mother's garden, the one clean memory she still trusted completely. He told her about a father who never once said he was proud of him, and a mother who died before he was old enough to properly grieve her. Neither of them fixed anything by saying it aloud, but something in both of them settled slightly, the way a wound settles once it's finally been looked at, instead of hidden. One night, sitting beside the training yard fire, long after everyone else had gone to sleep, Kalen finally said the thing he'd been circling for weeks. "My wolf didn't choose you for the crown, or the bloodline, or any prophecy in Celine's ledgers. It chose you the instant it saw you in that square, before it knew a single thing about what you were. It would have chosen you exactly the same, if you really had been nobody." Mira didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone smaller than he'd ever heard it. "I'm terrified of losing you, more than I've ever been afraid of anyone finding me. 15 years, I was only ever afraid for myself. Now I'm afraid for both of us, and I don't know how to carry that much fear at once." Kalen reached up, his hand finding her jaw the way it had found her wrist that first night on the stairs. Gently, without any intention of letting go. She leaned into it. He leaned toward her. For one full breath, the war outside the walls simply ceased to exist. It was the first time in 15 years she had let herself want something without immediately calculating what it would cost her. Then the horn split the night apart. 3 short blasts instead of 3 long ones, the signal for an attack already underway, not one still approaching. Kalen was on his feet before the sound finished, sword already in hand, the softness in his eyes gone in an instant, replaced by something colder and far more familiar. "Stay close to me," he said. Beyond the walls, the Shadow King's army surged forward as one, and Blackstone's final battle began. This time, There would be no council chamber to retreat to afterward, and no morning left to plan around. This time, it was the last stand, or nothing at all. Blackstone's outer wall fell an hour before dawn. Weeks of siege ended not with a slow breach, but a sudden collapse. Stone giving way all at once, under a weight no ordinary battering ram could have produced. By the time the Shadow King's forces reached the inner courtyard, Kaelin's remaining soldiers were fighting a retreat through corridors built for defense, not survival. The throne room doors gave way just as the sun broke over the eastern hills, enough light to see exactly how few defenders remained standing. Caelin put himself between Mira and the doorway before the first enemy wolf crossed the threshold. He held the room longer than any single man should have, but numbers eventually mattered more than skill, and when a blade meant for Mira's throat found his shoulder instead, he went down hard enough that the whole hall seemed to hold its breath with him. Blood spread beneath him faster than any wound she had ever closed in the infirmary. For one terrible moment, Mira's healer's instincts and her fear collided into the same useless truth. There wasn't time. The Shadow King crossed the fallen bodies without hurrying, closing his hand around Mira's wrist before she could reach Caelin. "Open it," he said, voice colder than the frost that followed him everywhere. "Give the crown to someone who'll actually use it." Mira's whole body shook, torn between the man bleeding on the floor and the power clawing beneath her own skin, desperate for release. She reached for it, tried to obey, tried anything that might make him let Caelin live one more minute. Nothing answered. The power sat silent, refusing him exactly as it had refused every hunter for 15 years. "It won't come for you," she said, understanding it even as she spoke it. It was never mine to give away. It was only ever mine to choose. She wrenched free and crossed to Caelin instead, dropping to her knees in his blood. "Mira," his voice was barely a whisper. "I choose him," she said, loud enough for the whole ruined hall to hear, loud enough for the Shadow King, for Varric, for every soldier still breathing. Not the crown, not the bloodline. Him. She took his hand, didn't flinch from it this time, didn't pull away the way she had in the square all those weeks ago. She held on. The pulse that had once cracked stone now shattered the entire hall in silver light. Ancient wolves, pale as moonlight and long thought extinct, tore into existence between one heartbeat and the next, answering a call that had waited 1,000 years to be spoken. Frost and starlight rolled outward from where Mira knelt, climbing the broken walls, racing across the courtyard beyond. Every enemy wolf caught in that light folded to the ground at once, stripped of whatever borrowed strength the Shadow Council had given them. Caelin felt his own wolf rise inside him, like it never had before, no longer merely recognizing her, bound to her now, Ashbourne strength and moon magic woven into a single current, neither bloodline had carried alone in 1,000 years. For one breathless moment, silver light and shadow dark light braided together above them both, holding the unmistakable shape of a crown before dissolving back into the air. He rose to his feet, as though the wound in his shoulder no longer existed. Around them, Blackstone's shattered defenders watched the tide turn, in real time. The Shadow King's soldiers broke first at the edges, then all at once, fleeing an army of ghost-pale wolves that didn't need to kill them, only needed to be seen. Varric, sword still raised from the fighting, watched it happen with the same eyes that had once called Mira an unvetted stranger, unworthy of a crown. He said nothing at all. For the first time since the square, he didn't need to. By the time the sun cleared the hills completely, the Shadow King's army had collapsed into full rout. The Shadow King himself hadn't moved. He stood alone, amid his own retreating soldiers, watching the joined bloodline standing where his ambitions had just ended. And something in his expression shifted from fury into calculation. "You misunderstand," he said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. "I never needed to win this battle." He raised both hands, and the air around him began to darken, gathering into something far older and far hungrier than any spell Blackstone's histories had ever recorded. "I only needed enough of you both in one place to finish what should have ended 1,000 years ago." The air around him churned dark before Caelin understood exactly what he intended. Not death. Not for either of them alone. "The purge was never finished 1,000 years ago," the Shadow King said, his voice stretching thin and ancient beneath the growing dark. "A curse was bound into both bloodlines that day. meant to make certain the joining could never happen again. I only came to enforce what your ancestors already agreed to. For 15 years, Mira had treated her blood like a wound to hide. She let it become something else instead, standing straighter than she ever had in her life. Not a burden any longer, but a birthright she had never once been given the chance to claim. Then unbind it, she said, stepping forward before fear could catch up with her. Or we will. She reached for Kaelin's hand without hesitation this time. Not survival instinct, not desperation, simply choice. And the crown answered instantly, silver and shadow-black light rising together around them both. The Shadow King's spell met that light head-on, and for one terrible moment neither force yielded. Ancient curse against newly completed bond, straining the throne room's broken walls until stone dust rained from the ceiling. Caelin didn't fight the curse with strength alone. He fought it the way he'd fought for her from the very first day, refusing, simply, to let go. When the Shadow King's power lashed out one final time, a blind, dying strike aimed at Mira's back, Caelin was already there to catch it on his blade. And this time it was Mira who caught him in turn, the two of them holding each other upright through the worst of it. Something in the old magic finally cracked. Not violently, quietly, the way a held breath finally releases. The darkness unraveling around the Shadow King thinned to nothing, taking with it whatever ancient will had driven him for 1,000 years, until he dropped to his knees amid his own dissolving power, looking suddenly entirely human. The curse was broken. The first crown, no longer contested, settled over both of them, like something that had simply been waiting to come home. Word of the Shadow King's fall reached his scattered armies before midday. Kingdoms that had marched against Blackstone for 15 years surrendered within the week. Their old orders, hunt the Moonblood, kill the king, no longer making any sense once the curse that justified them had died with the man who enforced it. Lady Celeste's letters were found 3 days later, hidden behind a loose stone in her chambers, every one addressed to a Shadow Council courier. She didn't deny it when Rowan brought her before the throne. I only wanted what should have been mine, she said. It was never yours to have, Caelin answered. It was only ever hers to choose. Celeste was stripped of her title and exiled beyond Blackstone's borders before the week ended. And the castle, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, simply breathed. Peace, once it finally arrived, took its time settling in, the way most real things do. Months later, Blackstone's great hall overflowed for a coronation the whole kingdom had been waiting to witness. Selene placed the crown herself, old ceremony carrying new names, Caelin Ashbourne and Mira of the Moon Dynasty, king and queen of a throne, finally whole again. The Moon Dynasty, extinguished in every history book for 1,000 years, rose again in front of a hall that cheered until its voice gave out. Somewhere in that crowd, an old herb seller, who remembered a barefoot girl selling yarrow beside her, wept without quite knowing why. The forgotten orphan who had once knelt gathering spilled herbs from the mud now stood crowned in silver and starlight, and the kingdom did not see a stranger. They saw exactly what she had always been, finally allowed to be seen. On a clear afternoon not long after, Caelin led Mira back to Blackstone Square. The same stones, the same columns, though the rain that had once soaked them both had given way to open sky. He stopped her in almost the exact place her basket of herbs had spilled all those months ago. "If I asked again," he said, something playful finally softening the king's usual weight, "would you answer differently?" Mira laughed, the sound easy in a way it had never once been allowed to be before. "Asked what?" He grinned. It aged him down 10 years. "Are you taken?" She slipped her hand into his without a moment's hesitation. "I have been," she said, "ever since you refused to let me disappear." He kissed her there in the open square, in front of merchants and guards and nobles and every wandering wolf who happened to be watching. And this time, when the crowd erupted, no one mistook it for anything but joy. The girl who had spent 15 years trying to become invisible had finally understood the truth of it. Destiny had seen her all along, and one simple question, asked by a king who refused to look away, had changed not only her life, but the future of every wolf kingdom that came after. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.